really appreciate you guys doing this summer, seeing the impact that those opportunities.
How do we all want to get along?
Too much of a burden on you.
You
can distribute.
I don't know how you guys have kids. I really don't.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was bad enough to be able to get a one digit iPhone.
Hi, Nancy McBrady, Deputy Commissioner, Maine Department of Agriculture. I do believe the Commissioner is joining online and I'm here as well to answer any questions or she has to step away.
Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Loisum, Commissioner at DEP.
Steve Crane, Crane Brothers Drive.
I am Nancy Beersley. I'm the Acting Director at Maine CDC.
I'm Beth Valentine. I'm the Director of the PFAS Fund.
I'm Stacy Brenner. I represent Senate District 30, which includes all of Gorham and most of Scarborough. And I'm excited to be here with all of you today.
I'm Rick Bennett. I have the honor of serving 14 towns in Western Maine in the Maine Senate, across Androscoggin, Cumberland, and Oxford counties.
I'm Jim Buckle, and I'm the owner of the Buckle Farm in Unity, and we grow organic fruit and vegetables.
Adrienne Lee, Newbie Farm in Knox. I'm also co-chair of the Financial Business Support Subcommittee. And also marketing organic vegetables and flowers.
I'm Keisha Holmes from Misty Brook Farm, which is a livestock farm in Albion, Maine.
I'm Diane Rowland. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Sciences, Forestry and Agriculture and Director of the Experiment Station at the University of Maine.
Jody Tilton-Flood, I'm a dairy farmer in Maine's dairy capital, Clinton, Maine.
Moscow or Cortez in your Chrome, that might have something to do with it.
And that is our tech support, Todd Gordon with us today.
I'm nobody.
And, Representative Fay, I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm Representative Jessica Fay, represent House District 86. I apologize for being tardy. My oil leak came out of my car, so I was pulling out of my driveway, which is a scary thing.
Problem is it gives me. I tried both. Then I can even really.
Commissioner Beal, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Is that the only member joining us remotely? You know.
This is Becca Bolus. I'm here. You can hear me. Thank you.
Anyone else? So welcome, everybody. The purpose of today's meeting and the May 10th meeting is to get feedback from the advisory committee on the initial plan so that we can refine it in advance of the public hearing, which is scheduled for June 12th. So we'll be hearing back from all of our subcommittees and sort of walking through a pretty detailed look at the plan. And also considering whether there should be any recommendations for legislation or additional staffing for the PFAS fund going forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kay. Thank you.
I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of how we got to be at this point. I think you all know that about a year ago in April 2022, The legislature and governor established the PFAS fund. In November and December, this advisory committee met to identify initial priorities and to identify sort of the mission and scope of each of the 4 subcommittees. Between January and April of 2023, these 4 subcommittees met a total of 23 times over the 4 months for 47.5 hours. There were 39 people on these committees representing farmers, ag service providers, academics, physicians, state agencies, appraiser, lenders. I need to commend and acknowledge all of these advisory committee members for the substantial amount of work that they have done. They shared their insights, they advocated for measures to create a true safety net for farmers impacted by PFAS contamination. In working with these subcommittees, we sort of packaged their recommendations in these strategy tables that you all have in the draft plan. A couple of reasons for this, primarily to allow for consistent structure, to make it easy to compare things like documentation requirements, eligibility, intended beneficiaries. Those tables also include questions whether anyone will be disadvantaged. There's a question about equity. And the purpose of including these were nudges for ourselves to think, is anyone being left out? If so, what can the fund do to support people that are being left out? Or is that, have we identified areas where additional resources are needed that are beyond the scope of the PFAS fund? There are budgets in this plan, and I want to stress these are draft estimated budgets. We tried to ground the budgets on the best available data and reasonable assumptions. A lot of it, frankly, is speculation because we don't know how many people will take advantage of each program. So there are best guesses for now. I expect you've noticed that the total budget is about $78 million. We have 60 million to spend, so there's a mismatch there. I would ask the advisory committee as we go through today, the plan today, that as Senator Brenner said, the purpose is to think about what recommendations we want to advance in the public hearing that's going to be held on June 12th. So I guess if you feel ambivalent about a recommendation, if you're supportive of it, I would say let's advance those to public hearing. And really, if there's something that strikes you as just not quite a right fit, let's have a conversation about that and see if we can make modifications so that everybody on the advisory committee is comfortable with the recommendations that we're putting out for public input. I want to note that the plan identifies need for some long-term funding, for instance, for some staff positions, for maintenance and management of any properties that the state purchases, for long-term medical monitoring and treatment, and also a permanent mental health support program for the agricultural community. So I want to flag those as areas that will need ongoing support beyond the life of the PFAS fund. So I guess with that, I'm going to ask each of, or at least one of the co-chairs from each of the 4 subcommittees to kind of give an overview of their recommendations. And then we'll go one at a time, starting with financial and business support, followed by land and research. Health, we've had so many robust conversations, and that is a little bit of a different animal than the other recommendations because we're looking at recommendations not just for the farm community, but for folks whose drinking water wells have been impacted by land application of biosolids. So we're going to talk about all of those recommendations as a coherent whole at our next meeting on May 10th, rather than trying to do some of them now and some later. As I was saying, though, we'll ask each subcommittee to give an overview of their recommendations and then open it up for conversation from this advisory committee. And with that, I will turn the mouse over to Adrian Lee for the financial and business support subcommittee. Also, you can just scroll through.
Okay, cool. Hi. I just wanted to say, just to start, when you look at this list of folks on this committee, I do really feel from our meetings this spring that we had a really great team to try to like pull these recommendations forward that had like really put the best interest of looking like the broad perspective of different parts of the ag industry's needs and feel like we're really thoughtful in these recommendations, and understandably there's a lot of different components of this financial and business support that affected farmers need. And so we have, I would say, quite a few recommendations to go through. These are just some of our, like quick bullet list of the different recommendations that we're gonna go over today.
Funny.
Is that? Yeah, carry on. Okay. The first one being income replacement. I'm just gonna go through, I just kind of put some very basic outline of some of the kind of quick descriptors here. So the income replacement program has been really vital to farms as they've been getting kind of have their worlds kind of like initially that kind of initial need for like an initial response when farms have been impacted farmers find out about contamination of their farm and when it's impacting the financial viability of their business. And so the proposal that we are recommending from the subcommittee that we basically continue on with the current program that BAFRR is currently using. You know, you can see the different numbers in page 2 of this whole plan. You can see that the income replacement program is a pretty significant, dollar-wise, is a pretty significant portion of the overall budget that we are proposing for this subcommittee's work. And ultimately is this income replacement is going to basically provide up to a year's gross income replacement. I feel like I don't know how detailed should I go into like what this is, or should we just? And it's all also in this.
Right, I guess that's the question for the group. How much detail do you want the presenters to present, or do you feel comfortable sort of having discussion based on sort of the categories of recommendations? Income replacement, roster of experts, et cetera.
I suggest going by categories. If we need to get in depth, we can do that. Otherwise, I think it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, totally. And ultimately, just as a quick synopsis, that if you're not familiar with how the income replacement program is currently working, is it's basically providing like farmers take on average the highest grossing 3 years in the past 5 years or their prior year's gross income, and that is what's used to calculate payments to help ensure that a farm is going to be able to kind of continue on in that initial discovery period, and that we are recommending that currently that program is slated for is currently just kind of slated for like the first year. We are recommending that it be for the first 2 years of after discovery. We can go into, if you have questions about eligibility or anything else, I'm happy to go through that. The next strategy that we are addressing is the concept of having a roster of experts that is going to really support those farms that have found this contamination as far as how to move forward, build new enterprise budgets, look at like mediation strategies, technology, what they may need, tools that they may need in order to pivot, address like just a different financial reality, and just also trusting that the farmer themselves might have the best sense of like what those relationships might, what supports they may need. So there'll be a roster of experts that that the fund is kind of pre-approved. And then the farmers can directly seek advice from specialists that they may already be working with and get reimbursed for the fund. As far as the financial cost of that, our estimate is, and this is for, like Beth was saying, like our estimates, I guess, I don't know if I need to go into too much detail here, but like our estimates are definitely based off of like thoughtful analysis of like the best steps that we have to kind of come up with these. So we're looking at like 1.2 million for that. Does anyone have any questions about the first two kind of components of our recommendations, or otherwise let's move? Yeah.
Why 2 years?
Well, when a farmer has a discovery of PFAS on their farm and when that may happen in their cropping cycles, can really directly impact what that short-term response time is going to need to be. That's a big part of it. And also recognizing that, especially in these first initial years of this programming, farmers were discovering these issues way before there was any sort of support network to actually support them. And so recognizing that, like, this is recognizing too that like some of those supports, because some of that support wasn't there, there's also to be like potential for to continue support in those for 2 years. It's also elective that a farmer doesn't necessarily, it's all based on like if a farmer is showing for income replacement, if a farmer is showing after that first year that they are able to kind of bounce back, it doesn't, their ability to kind of come into that second year is kind of tied to like their projections on if their sales are going to
Actually,
lower.
worried about it not being long enough. Just wondering whether there was a rationale for limiting it to just 2 years.
I'm happy to put that out to the group. I think my first response to that would be thinking of it as like, we're setting up that income replacement as like one tool in the toolbox to kind of support the farmer initially. And then a lot of these other components of the financial and business support would be kind of fleshed in as that farmer is maybe having to redraft a business plan and think about what those next steps are. And that's where like the infrastructure investment and stuff might come. So I think it's addressing like what issues, what's the best way to kind of, I don't want to say put a Band-Aid on it, but it's kind of like, what can you do to kind of keep the farmer?
Minimize the patient.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then move forward. I don't know if that would be a good assessment.
We had a very lengthy discussion about this, and what we want to do is take that immediate pressure right off. So stabilize the patient so that they have the opportunity to explore the other options and provide them with a suite of opportunities so that income replacement, so hopefully we're able to provide them with other tools so that they can start generating the income. Or if they choose to go in a different direction.
Yeah, thanks for that question. One question before we leave that section. So when you're sort of looking at this projected out to fiscal year 28, and we're thinking that we will be through tier 4 by the end of 25. Depending on what the discovery looks like, and it's 3, our largest group is 2, where we land. Was there conversation about more money being spent up front and maybe not needing as much towards fiscal year 28, and whether or not we would provide that support as needed, more in the beginning and less at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we were pulling these numbers. It was looking at kind of where things are at and what the projections are moving forward in this year. And I might throw it off to Nancy to kind of help give a little perspective there when we were trying to think about the impacted farmers and how that would play out over the next few years.
I do think that the budget does reflect a scaling down by the 27-28 timeframe. Of course, there's a lot of unknowns. It's hard to say whether someone who was a tier 1 farm was going to have a higher income replacement need than someone who is in a tier 4. It's really site dependent and farm dependent. But at the same time, perhaps there could be some truth to that that will play out depending on the levels that are at a farm that are found later versus now. And we've also not necessarily, being the department that has been doing income replacement for the last year or so, and will be segmented to the farm, to the fund. We've had a couple of farms, there's a couple of ranges. Some farms have chosen to cease production entirely, and so there has been a larger payout, so to speak, in one fell swoop, versus those who continue to work to find a viable path forward, demonstrate their losses, and the payments are spread out over time. So I think the most that we have spent on a farm is close to $500,000. Others have been far more modest, but we're continuing to work with them and track with them. So there's probably more information that's not necessarily precisely answering your question, but those are the data points that we've been utilizing.
And just one additional question, was there any speculative conversation about what would happen with the next cycle of the farm bill and whether or not if there were federal money to come in, if that would help provide some relief to the state in terms of?
We certainly have pushed for that. We're not necessarily hearing that more new funds will become available, but rather USDA in particular would be looking at the programs already in existence and whether or not they could be adapted to PFAS. So I don't believe that there will be any funding for this type of activity in the near term.
Thank you.
I actually have a question in terms of, it's a fairly, so do we think that the projected expenditures are going to be sufficient to cover what we need? I mean, I think that's similar to what Senator Brenner was asking, but.
Well, what I can say is, I think the number's been now familiar to many of you. We're working with 56 farms, varying levels of contamination. Not everyone has requested or required income replacement help. Of the, I want to say, and I can confirm this, 6 or so farms that we have helped, we're hitting about $1 million income replacement solely. So again, hard to say if 6 equals 1 million, and but that's all that we've got right now for, if we can even call it a trend.
And then one more question, I noticed that under the grid, the question, will anyone be disadvantaged? And there is a discussion of income replacement being taxed. Is there any discussion of potentially figuring out a way either around that legislatively, or whether that was actually an official opinion of MRS?
Did we talk about that?
Well, it was brought up that during periods when a farm is receiving income replacement, but they're not actively farming, they have, fewer expenses, and therefore, they can't deduct those expenses. They have a greater tax burden. We did discuss, potentially making this non-taxable income. And we abandoned that, but I'm not recalling why. Jim?
In my experience with the income replacement of last year, the state tax bill was not the problem. The state tax bill was like hundreds as opposed to thousands on the federal level. And I'm not sure there's any way to convince the IRS to give it back. You know, like, I think it was, I want to say that the federal tax bill was 10 times the state tax bill.
That's helpful, thank you. Tom, do you see?
Yeah, and it does also, I would just say too, it really varies on like the income replacement and what that farmer is just choosing to do as far as like how that matches. If they're continuing on with production, they're still gonna have all their expenses that they're the average farmer, what you actually, your gross sales and your expenses, it's not like, like the equation is, unfortunately, there's not a huge difference between those two things so much. This is helping with, there is, I think, of a farm, there'll be such a variation in like how much of an offset a farm's operation is gonna have as far as their expenses that like, I don't know, it seemed to me when we were having that conversation, it just seemed like something that we really couldn't really touch, really, like that needed to just kind of ultimately, besides maybe having within that roster of experts, having somebody that can help advise and support a farmer in those decisions related to how their tax burden is gonna be affected. That seems like what this committee could do.
Great, thank you for answering that.
Yeah, and I do think this roster of experts is gonna be really key to helping provide a good toolkit for farmers as they are in that transition period, in that 1 or 2 year income replacement and doing lots of testing, trying to figure out what their path forward is, having support, and having that support be funded, and not only funded, but also making a good effort of making sure that as a committee, we can sometimes just finding the right people is like a hurdle for a farm. So by having a roster of people that are experienced in either have already been working with effective farms or in general are just like keyed into the ag community that role that we are recommending that I just used the term a minute ago, caseworker. It's kind of the same thing. It's like someone that's going to help an impacted farmer navigate through the system of not only just helping have a better clarity on like what supports they can find within this within the PFAS fund, but also the broader support network for the state and nonprofits. There's a great list out on page 8 too, kind of what we are suggesting, like these navigators how they could play a role with these individual farmers. I definitely see this as a very critical role that we need to fill, and a very big current gap in the support that farmers, well, not current gap, I mean, there's a lot of, there's definitely support for farmers from a variety of sources, but having someone that could like really be that kind of key person for farms to work with, I think would be really critical. And then the.
Can I say something about the navigator?
Yeah.
I think part of the discussion we had, right, is that the navigator was on the farmer's side, and it wasn't that the department's doing something evil, but we just wanted someone that was like in our corner that we know is sort of like, definitely on our side, listening to us a little bit more, because the department's so busy. It's tough to keep all that, but if this person or people can
and
really
like
be your teammate,
recognizing the difference between, there is the
Ombudsman?
No, like currently, like the folks that we, as a farmer, affected farmer.
service provider.
No, they're called like.
Ag compliance.
Ag compliance, like they're called ag compliance officers, just even in the name, like just like.
Talked about changing that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, just really, I think ensuring that there's like a support that the farmer feels it's like, where you're not feeling like you're fighting for the things you need, but more like someone's like really helping you propel you forward is really like, I would say, the energy that we're trying to convey through having these navigators, feeling like these are the things that we can do to help you in this time of crisis.
People tense up with the word compliance, it's like, yeah.
Because you're using navigators in the plural, but I'm looking at the salary. It doesn't look like there's a lot of.
Yeah.
That is navigator.
Yeah. I think that this comes down to a couple of different components, right? There's like, when it comes to roles within salaries, like this, I'm almost gonna put this to you and Nancy, and just like having someone on staff, like the cost of that, the logistics of hiring, who you could hire, finding those people, how many farmers is this person gonna need to work with? I'm curious how you guys want to frame that.
And so part of the discussion was that the department could certainly hire for this role, but also the service providers, Maine Farmland Trust, MOFGA, maybe they could also like and/or have navigators. And there's, potential for mixed messages if we have different organizations supporting this role. An advantage of having the private organizations do it is that they can likely hire a lot more quickly than the state can. The advantage of having somebody in-house, when a more person is obviously, they would be, working on behalf of the state to directly assist farmers and, as you said, propel folks forward. So I guess, the idea was the likelihood would be to start with one person and then if we still need additional capacity, then maybe seek additional staffing down the road. Becca, do you have a question?
I just had a comment. I love this section from a public health perspective. The medical care development offers a community health worker initiative program. And from what I read of this description of a navigator, there's a lot of overlap with what you've outlined for a navigator with what a community health worker could do. And I'm not really familiar with the ins and outs of their program right now, like how many are part of it and the funding and all those different aspects, but I would be happy to connect you with folks there. I think that would be something worth looking into to include in this recommendation as just another option for that support. So I just wanted to raise that initiative.
Yeah, thank you. What is the organization?
It's called Medical Care Development. They're based in Augusta. MCD Global, actually, I think is their new name. Nancy might know better than me.
Yes, it is. MCD Global.
Okay, thanks.
When we were looking at like salaries and that stuff too, we were really looking at like comparing it to like casework. I remember really trying to figure out like what number to put there, and definitely we're factoring in like how comparable salaries might work within the state.
Right, like in medical setting, what would
Yeah.
a caseworker earn? And the state equivalent of a caseworker was actually, the salary was a bit lower than an ed compliance officer or an advocate. Those are two already existing state categories of jobs.
Looks like that doesn't include any fringe benefits, right? And that's just salary.
I believe you.
Next
Fringe,
one.
I think so.
Next one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay,
I broke it out,
because it seems really low.
right.
Yeah.
Got it, thank you.
Can I ask a question about this position as well? It's envisioned here that it's paid for out of the fund. And this is only because, I'm wearing my budget hat. Did you have a conversation about the pros and cons of, having this person work outside the fund versus be paid through the fund versus being paid from some other pot of money.
You mean as far as like who would ultimately, like how you'd have?
Yeah, like who would be the person, what would be the entity that this person would report to? I mean, I understand that the position would be envisioned to be there for the farmers to help navigate all this. But who would be what would be the structure of it? I guess that would be just the thing that I think that if we're gonna make a recommendation, it would be really helpful to flesh out. Where the money comes from, I think is less important than the structure and who's gonna do the hiring. Maybe you, right?
Yeah, so my initial thinking is that this person will be in the commissioner's office in the PFAS fund unit, the unit of one at the moment. So I think that would be a sensible place to house this person.
Is part of your question tied at all to like the fund, like where how things are funded as far as when we have like X amount of a pot of money and how much we're spend what versus
A
like
little
what we
bit.
ask for if we're asking for more money?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we're having budget discussions now, and so the question is always, for me at least, in this fund, like direct expenditures on helping farmers, and how does this count? Because it feels like it's a direct expenditure helping farmers, but yet the person's helping. Does that make sense?
It's like you mean like the fact that it's like a salary versus a direct?
Yeah,
Expense.
it's a service versus a direct expense. Thank you. That was really helpful.
Service.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Just that's how my brain goes.
Is there a risk of if this was something that had, like, I don't really know enough of the ins and outs on voting on, like,
Yeah, no,
to
I
me, I
totally
like wanna make
understand.
sure that like this stuff, no matter what, that'd be my only, like, how does a position stick? Regardless of where the appetite is in the annual fiscal budget.
It's a really important consideration.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That'd be a question.
Yeah, it really would.
So for the interest of time, I just want to point out that we have three big topics we want to cover and we're 40 minutes in. So maybe we'll have you zip through and.
Happy to.
Okay.
Yeah. Operational response payments, these are kind of still tied in the initial short term, we're calling short term, which is, we kind of coined as those first few years, correct? For all of these. So these, currently this has been used for things like feed, been used for the, what other type of operational expenses are we using currently is like currently following
At
under?
present, the Bureau of Agriculture provides funds that will help the farm make adjustments and investments. So arguably operational investments. So clean feed, equipment, needing to literally help someone put up new fencing so that their cattle no longer got into a contaminated water body. So the things that will allow a farm to continue to operate, but because of their situation, the farmers do not have the capital to make that investment themselves.
Was it something also like our one herd of cows we were cleaning off and the other herd was coming and you needed like staff to manage one of the herds and the other herd, your staff needs climbed up because I'm sorry,
Yes,
beating around the bush, I'm sorry.
It's true.
Yeah. So was that one of the examples we used and that was, or was it sheep? I think you had, right? Like,
Yeah, we also had sheep
Yeah,
that we took care of.
right, you had like
Didn't have
two
the income
pools of
from.
animals that you needed
Yeah.
more salary to run that herd, right? Is that would fall into
Yes.
these operational?
Our labor costs last year were definitely a lot higher than
Yeah.
previous years.
And there's like that cost, and then we also were trying to find a way to build into this response, just recognizing the additional labor costs of when this happens on a farm, ultimately probably one of the farm owners or managers is gonna have like a significant amount of their time that is pulled out of their operational management, and there's gonna be a cost to maintain that operation, whether that's hiring employees to try to replace that owner's time, or them having to work additional hours just on top of their busy days. And so trying to recognize how to address that is definitely part of what we're recommending here. I don't know if there's any questions in this section of kind of what Stacy has, like we can be talking about as far as time, if there's any questions.
If I could just say a quick clarification.
Yeah.
On the last page there, 13, it talks about compensating people. So you've got two buckets, then you've got capital expenditures, if I understand. This is a little bit, farm management services, $20 an hour. That seems a little funny to kind of.
How to quantify
Yeah,
that?
quantify that, and just like, I get the capital expenditure piece, how that differs from income replacement. Not sure about this one.
As far as how we quantify that?
How to
we figure-
quantify, how to, how to manage it, how to get, whatever exposures you need on that in order to make
Like
sure
documentation.
some of these other concerns about the double, double payments or whatever are, yeah, all that.
Like how, what the whole, I mean, I would say at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, but like we are putting, I think we are putting forward like the recommendations and trying to do our best as far as like proposing like a salary. I think that there still is work to do to determine how to make sure that like if someone was going to apply for management compensation, like what that framework is going to be. We haven't really,
That's fine.
we haven't really been able to like create the checks and balances there yet. Like we haven't gone that deep, I would say, yet.
Right, we talked about options like asking people to track their time
Yeah.
and, truly that's, on our system. Or maybe we calculate on average, it takes a farmer X number of hours per month to deal with PFAS contamination and we just set a flat rate. But of those two options or other potential options, we have not made a decision.
Okay, so there's a lot of thinking yet to be done here, but do you have any sense of how much of this $500,000 a year would be operating costs like that versus capital expenditure?
My hunch is that every farm could potentially apply for the PFAS response payment, like, the extra time it takes to respond, whereas it will be a smaller subset of farms that need these operational payments on top of the other programs that are being proposed.
Follow-up, maybe clarifying question. So how would you see, in terms of capital, how would you see sort of the delineation between the operational expenses and then the infrastructure, which is the next section?
Yeah, like I think it's really much more like the fixed investments, infrastructure, like literal like infrastructure, which is compared to things that are more like feed, planting stuff.
Would the differentiation potentially be a fixed asset versus an annual expense? Would that be
One
how you might
payment.
find it?
Well, I don't is
For operational payment versus infrastructure?
yeah. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you?
I just say this, I just heard conflicting things. I heard like using it for fencing, which seems to me like maybe infrastructure versus, I get the.
I guess there's a variety of different types. I mean, fencing, you can kind of probably go a few different directions as far as what's temporary or fixed. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is probably a bit of a line there between, there's a line in any farm between like if something is what the fixed asset is, or like if there's something that you're using. Yeah, like where the annual operational cost versus like the fixed asset. I think that there's probably a bit of a gray line of a lot of farms.
In my mind, I divide it like a depreciable expense and an expense that I can,
Yeah.
yeah, like once an expense becomes a depreciable item. That's how I separated it in my head.
With the fencing example, I think the example was that when you fenced out the cows and you need to bring it, and you're bringing in an additional herd, it's the labor expense for the additional herd that falls under the operations budget. The fencing would fall under the infrastructure budget. That makes sense.
It certainly does.
It's just not separated out in the department right now.
That's correct, and the fencing, I'm confuse things a little bit more, but the Bureau of Ag has our ag compliance officers, people in the field who are attempting to understand for these farms through a lot of sampling, what the blueprint is for the farm going forward. As a result of that, we, in working with the farm, might recognize you do not have enough access to clean feed, and we will help provide the clean feed for X amount of time until alternatives can be found. So we as a bureau won't stop that because the PFAS fund is happening. The PFAS fund in particular is defining infrastructure as fixed assets over $150,000. Up and until that $150,000 trigger, we at the Bureau are going to be doing a whole lot of work on this sort of global viability, right? So if I'm talking about things that we've been doing to date, that's truly what the Bureau's been doing to date. And I don't mean to infer that the fund will likewise be doing some of these smaller viability projects. I think as page 14 states, infrastructure projects valued in excess of $150,000. That's the capital investment there, if that's helpful.
It is, thanks.
Yeah, and so I don't know what, I think Nancy just did a really good job describing this goal of this fund really being the projects that are up and exceeding $150,000. Does anyone have any other questions about that as far as infrastructure works? One thing that was also flagged in the subcommittee was the potential need for loan assistance, whether loan guarantees, farmers, just kind of recognizing that farmers may not have the same access to loans that they might have had before their discovery of PFAS. And so what kind of supports are going to be there, and or like loans are often based off of prior year's history and how reduction in operation might affect ability for borrowing power to the farm. I think this is pretty, I would say low, I would almost say at least having this fund help to be a backer of loan guarantees, I think would be really, I wouldn't say low risk, but because there's obviously risk there, but it's could be a way to support farms without having to directly hold the ticket, just being able to guarantee those loans. I don't know if anyone, if you have anything else you want to flag here. And then lastly, talking about, we were just recommending that we are helping farmers with public relations and marketing efforts through just recognizing that there's going to be additional costs for farmers to kind of maintain their brand, communicate, and we aren't putting I would say there's not a huge amount of funding and money going towards this, but definitely recognizing that there is, this is a meaningful way that this fund could support farmers in maintaining their brand and their business as they work through this PFAS discovery, and then also the rebranding. And then this PFAS response kit is really, I think, a great tool that's also already kind of in the work. We put together as like a way to have like, kind of like, you've got PFAS discovery on your farm, here's your kind of like, like, I don't know, welcome to the club pamphlet on like all the, this is the ways that you can be supported, and these are things like, kind of like just at least that initial entry place that farmers can have, and then hopefully also then those navigators can help back up. But this is kind of a goal of having a binder ultimately that the farmer can use as a resource.
And just ask you. So just going back to the loan, so it's on page 18 under the cost budget. I'll figure out how much lending we're actually supporting here for this proposal. And the FSA guaranteed funds, it says 10,800 annually for $800,000 in funds. There's $210,000 annually for commercial loan insurance, and it allows approximately $400,000 of insured commercial loans.
This is definitely a little bit beyond I might refer to
like-
Beth here on like the logistics, how this works, I've tried to follow it.
So that's because FAME would require up to 50% of the funds held in reserve, which so we wouldn't necessarily, at the end of the loan term, that money would likely be released back to the fund, but it would have to be tied up in order to guarantee the FAME loans or the commercial insurance through FAME. So yes, we get a lot more bang for the buck going supporting FSA loans. But it's, as I understand it, FSA loans are more paperwork intensive, more complicated to get. And it's possible that, a farm wouldn't be able to get an FSA loan, but would be able to get a FAME loan. But the cost to the fund would be significantly more for the FAME.
Is that recoverable money though?
Yes.
And when does it recovered, and what happens to it when it's recovered?
So it would be held in reserve, and in my conversations with FAME, either the department could hold it in reserve, or maybe we would transfer it to FAME and they would hold it in reserve, and it would be released, assuming that the borrower fulfills their loan obligations. At the end of the loan term, that money would be released back to the fund.
And what is the presumed loan term?
It varies.
7 to 30 years, so 40.
I don't know, it seems like you're tying up a lot of capital there for, that we could just deploy at 50% of the cost of, of the capital that's being, maybe it's better just to push it out, lending directly, and then have some, it's not a huge amount of money in the great scheme, but I just be interested.
Yeah, that's a notable discrepancy
Yeah.
between the two options.
And maybe something that could, like when we're trying to whittle down the actual amount that we're budgeted, like how do we make those choices, right?
Yeah. Or
Or like
come up
what
with
the
a,
fund can support.
come up with a different model, FAME provides loan insurance effectively, and it just seems like really, okay, so it's reserve and you can recover it maybe, but it just seems kind of expensive, and it's not pushing the money out now to the people who need it now. Instead, we're holding reserve to satisfy FAME with lending needs. So just something maybe to work on.
And with current inflation, it might just be sitting there losing money rather than doing something.
$1 million.
Yeah. I think the question there too, though, is definitely tied to like whatever. It could also be tied to like the reality of like, I think what Beth was highlighting too, just sort of accessibility of those loans, the loans to the farmer. Whether it's speed of getting a loan through or the type of loan that you're looking for, and like how the farmer very well may need something different than the FSA. I'm just recognizing there's, I think within the group, definitely we were trying to address a broad variety of farms.
Thankfully, I'm slowing the conversation down. It's just, one quick other question. Do we have any sense of how large the loan might be on average or typically?
Depends on the size of the farm.
It's $400,000 per year, so I'm just wondering.
We were thinking loans of approximately $70,000. And we could do, a handful each year.
Like one farm might be able to do quite a bit with 70, another farm it would be like not gonna do much.
And I think this also ties to like that farms need to have a loan guarantee or not, it's really gonna be tied to like how this is affecting them operationally year to year and whether the traditional lending opportunities have been impacted by PFAS or not, right? And that might depend on scale, that might depend on level of contamination, so that there's a few different factors there.
You bring up a good point. Another element of this recommendation is education out to lenders and also what sort of documentation can the department provide? A letter stating that the farm has adopted these measures, their test results show there's no contamination, food is safe, any orders preventing the sales have been lifted. So providing that documentation to make lenders more comfortable.
I had one more thing in that section. I thought the public relations and marketing numbers were really low. Those are expensive resources, but there's something, it's a great placeholder. I think it's a great idea. It's just, they're really expensive.
Yeah. I guess that's all tied to just like how what the most. I'm trying to figure out as a group where the priorities are, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, it's marketing and promotion, like that, just the actual work of that is, don't get much for a lot of money.
Right.
It is expensive work.
Exactly. Balance.
Right.
And
And
also,
also,
thank you for taking the lead on presenting to us all of your hard work.
No, yeah, thanks for helping me. Shepherd us through the meeting.
Shall we move on to Lamb?
I would like to introduce for those who don't know, Alice Redfield.
Oh, yeah.
Alice is co-chair of the Land Subcommittee with Sherry Hamill from FSA. Sherry, are you online?
Just join us.
Yeah, she's also having heard from us today.
I am here.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Beth, can you hear me?
We can't hear you. Thanks, Sherry.
Oh, good. I apologize. I was so excited I could actually come to a meeting in person today and got to the end of 395 in Bangor and my transmission came on overheating and had to have my car towed. So anyways, I'm glad it was Bangor though, not Augusta, I guess. And it's still under warranty, so that's a plus. So did you just I can't see the slides, Beth. So do you want me to
Let Alex take the lead introducing and then you hop in as you're able?
Can you make the slides for the Zoom audience too? Beth has to do that.
Okay, in the interim, I could maybe start with a narrative introduction.
Just for a moment.
Great, so our subcommittee met with the overall goal of trying to build out a land acquisition program as part of the fund. And it morphed into not only that, but a sort of corollary program where we might pay farmers who choose to stay on the land. And so we're going to talk about all of those strategies. I guess I could start by saying this is pretty new territory for certainly the Bureau of Agriculture. We're not really in the business of buying and selling land. And so there will be a growth curve and trying to reflect some of the staffing needs and the timeline in our strategy build out. But happy to sort of talk through the different options that we had Again, the overarching goal was to try to center farmer needs and wishes while mapping out a framework that might be functional and effective for the state and for the department. Sherry, can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Are you still good to start with the land acquisition element?
I am.
Great.
I will start. If you guys, can't hear me, please just holler at me. So I guess first I want to, thank the PFAS board for letting me be on this subcommittee. I learned a lot. We had some very dedicated members on this subcommittee. We, put a lot of time into this. So again, thank you for letting me participate. So we actually came up with 4 different recommendations that we'll go through today, try to get that, the high level overview. The first one was to purchase PFAS impacted property. The second strategy would be where the state of Maine holds and manages acquired land. The third one is to make payments to landowners who retain the land and implement conservation practices. And then the fourth thing we talked about was guidance on real estate transactions to general public and those involved in real estate transactions like realtors, lenders, et cetera. And for the first 3 strategies that we'll talk about, the properties that meet the statutory definitions of commercial farming or agricultural land will meet the initial eligibility criteria for these options. And of course, the state will need to, develop some further internal rules and policies to set priorities and future, guides how we're going to handle this. So the first one that I'll talk about is the actual land transfer. So we broke the whole process down into 10 steps, kind of like to call it the 10-step process, 10-step plan. Again, we'll go through these in a high overview. There's a lot of details involved, but hopefully you'll get a gist of, what we're thinking. So the first step, obviously, is that the landowner would have to have a confirmed contamination, either through, their own testing or testing through DEP or state of Maine's testing programs. Once they have that confirmed contamination, any interested landowner would need to notify state of Maine with a letter of intent. Possibly the state of Maine would want to develop an application, like an application form or some type of template for these landowners to use to submit their intent to sell or their wish to sell their land. The landowner would then need to notify also the state of Maine with any relevant information, which may include, the property description, obviously the address, location of the property, acres involved, if they know their soil types, if there's any buildings on the property, and kind of, what they have in mind, whether they want to sell all the real estate and the buildings or retain the buildings and sell the real estate, or maybe just sell 20 acres out of the 100. So we'd need to get all that information, from the landowner. Once all that information is received, the state of Maine would need to conduct their preliminary review. Kind of go through their, assuming the state of Maine will have, some criteria set up. So they would, look at that information, possibly have a review panel to look at these. And then consider, in their preliminary internal review, they would also maybe look at infrastructure and see if this land, is tied to agricultural viability. Will state of Maine purchase the infrastructure as well? So, lots of different things to think about within that step during that review process. If it's decided to move forward, an appraisal will be ordered of the property. That will be at the state of Maine's expense. At that point, once an appraisal is back, a purchase and sale agreement would need to be generated with an estimated purchase price contingent on due diligence going forward. Once we have a signed purchase and sale agreement, then at the state of Maine's expense, due diligence would have to be done to actually look at, boundaries, surveys, looking at environmental reviews or environmental assessments, phase 1 or phase 2, and see what all those findings are. So that could be a pretty in-depth and could be an expensive process, as well. Once all that is done, then the seller of the state of Maine would reach a final agreement on purchase price and update the purchase and sale as necessary. At that point, we'd be ready for closing and need to prepare, through a contract attorney, most likely, the closing for the property. So very high level overview there. State of Maine, like I said, would have to develop a lot of internal policies and, how they want to, do the reviews. And like I talked about, a review panel and how the applications would be processed, any priorities, if it would be first come, first serve, or, some other priority level, if you want to call it that. So again, very high overview there.
Maybe just two more notes before open it to discussion. The purchase price would be determined by the appraisal, and the appraisal would be conducted as if the property weren't contaminated. So it's receiving fair market value despite its contamination. And the appraisers that we reached out to verified that is doable and a possible estimate to come up with. And then all of the due diligence from the appraisal on down, each one of those steps is something that the department has some familiarity with, and we can use some of the same resources and staff capacity that the LMF program and the Farmland Protection Program have. So it's not that we would need to start from total scratch on all of those elements. There's some models that we can use in some existing relationships.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for clarifying that. I guess another comment too, we sell the land, I say we, the state selling the land, most likely there would be different restrictions placed on the property on how that property, could be used going forward as well. Like, probably some more to talk about along those lines later.
I have two questions for you guys. The first one is, did you talk at all about properties that have existing easements? And then the second one is, at the department, have we had, and if, a rough estimate of folks that have expressed interest in the purchase program?
Yeah, I think the program would operate regardless of whether or not an existing easement is on the property. And so the presence of a conservation easement wouldn't limit participation, but would be factored into the appraisal and the purchase price because those development rights have already been extinguished. In terms of how a conservation easement interacts with PFAS contamination, that's a conversation we didn't have as part of our discussion, but one that is happening elsewhere. For example, if an easement requires a property be in active agricultural production and that farmland can no longer be in agricultural production without jeopardizing the health and well-being of the food system, then that needs to be a fix that's done statutorily with the Attorney General's office. And what was your second question?
I guess.
Oh, interest?
Yeah.
Yeah. We've heard of a few farms that have expressed interest, but understand that without anything on the table for farms to consider, we're not really sure. I think the number was 2 that we know right now. So the budget projections are pretty loose and assume a pretty high participation rate, and we're not really sure if that would bear out in practice.
I guess a couple of questions I have. Well, I see, here that's saying, the fund would not purchase non-agricultural land. How does you envision with this program, like, I think of a farm as like a whole property, or is this more specifically like, would this fund only purchase the active agricultural land? Or would this fund purchase a farmstead in a situation like that? And how does that play into it? I guess that'd be my first question.
The way we discussed it, the fund should be willing to acquire the parcel in its entirety. If a farmer wants to split it up and sell less, then that would be an option. But even if a 100-acre farm only has 10 acres of vegetable production, the fund should be willing to buy all 100 acres because the viability of that property has been jeopardized, and the fund should own up to that.
Yeah, I guess I look at more in light of like if a farmer was going to try to move their operation somewhere, they're not just gonna be buying. Just the land itself isn't gonna do that. And then similarly, I guess I'm curious about what the section that talks about like what still needs to be developed, and so maybe I shouldn't even go there, but like when you're trying to get an estimate on how many farms might participate in this, a concern I just have as far as figuring out what that budget number is gonna be is like not creating situations where say a farmer they've been a dairy farmer their whole life and then they like are there for generations and like they can't logistically can't make it work as their farm can't work as any sort of farm that's producing anything off of like their grassland base, right? But they could switch the whole farm over and grow winter squash or something. It's not part of their business plan, not something they want to do. From a funds perspective, the land still could be used agriculturally, but it's nothing like the enterprise that they had planned. Like I'm just curious about the plan to like weigh how the fund can be utilized. Like as far as choosing what operations the fund would be willing to purchase so that a farmer can continue in the type of farming that they currently are versus just like if there's really if there's no safe agricultural use versus just different cropping systems and a farmer's willingness to pivot.
Yeah, I think the way our conversation evolved was again centering the farmer's desire first.
Mhm.
And if a farmer desired to switch from one enterprise to another, amazing. If the farmer wants to sell, amazing. We're not going to limit, the fund wouldn't exclude somebody from participating in the buyout if another enterprise was available.
Mhm.
Like the eligibility is very broad by design. If you have contaminated soil and water, then you'd be eligible for this, regardless of if there's potential for you to shift your business model and become a squash farm instead.
Yeah, mostly just wanting to make sure that there's enough money budgeted in the fund so that it doesn't create.
We budgeted a lot of money, but I don't know. Yeah.
And so one other question, did you guys get into the discussion at all of sort of where in state government the land is held and what happens to it?
Yeah, we did. That's the next
Great.
slide.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure,
that?
yeah.
So if I'm an agricultural landowner and I lease my property out to a vegetable operation.
Yeah.
That vegetable operation has significant infrastructure on the land, but they're not the landowners. And so I decide as the ag landowner, I'm going to sell it because it's contaminated. And then there's all this existing infrastructure that the farmer who's leasing has loans against, operations against and stuff. And they want to be made whole on their way out the door. Is this the place to compensate like a wash house they built, a building they built, a greenhouse they built, fencing and such that they've added to the property, but can't take advantage of the program because they're not the landowner?
Great question. Didn't discuss a scenario like that. Ideas that come to mind right now is that there could be a sort of clawback clause for the owner of the infrastructure on the property that's sold that gets baked into the transaction. We could put that in essentially the rules of the program to make sure that if there were a farmer that owned infrastructure, that there would be some sort of remuneration for that. But that is me talking right now, so
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how that evolves.
I think, there's a lot of non-landowning farmers in
Yeah.
the world who could have their farm just pulled out from under them.
Yeah.
Sort of instantly, if the landowner enters into this agreement with the state.
Yeah.
So. Cool. Just a
Kind of, yeah. Yeah.
Quick question.
Sure.
Am I understanding correctly that you would be buying these properties, but then potentially also offering them up for sale with restrictions? Was that what I was hearing?
Yeah, that's next.
Okay.
Great. Other questions on the sort of acquisition phase? Cool. So let's say the department now owns a bunch of ag land. What happens? Option one is, regardless, there are options. The department can sell it, depending on how science evolves and what the intended use is. It could lease the property, also depending on the property and the sort of state of research. Or it can hold the land in perpetuity, which isn't great because holding land costs money. And this is ag land, and the state's goal is to return ag land to agriculture. But because each property is different and because the science is evolving, we're not really making any prescriptions here. Instead, what we suggest is that either the same review panel or a different review panel at the department revisits each property on a regular basis to determine what suitable uses or conveyance terms would look like. There could be a squash farmer that wants to buy an old dairy farm and wants to bring it back into ag use right away, even though it is unsuitable. I'm assuming that squash doesn't take PFAS up from your scenario.
Well, I'm just saying, the
Okay.
difference between trying to raise
Yeah.
grass or.
So there could be an agricultural operation that wants to start on a contaminated property. That also brings major yellow flags to the department of like inviting somebody to operate a food production business without being able to limit that person from bringing products into market that are dangerous. And so the sort of legal protection for the food system is something that will need a lot of attention from some real experts on before land gets sold. But just wanted to introduce the framework of this sort of suite of options that any given parcel could be directed towards once the state holds it, and then encouraging people to review those options on a regular basis. We did a little bit of work in trying to figure out how much it costs for the state to hold land. And again, the cost of a field that needs to be mowed once a year is pretty cheap. The cost of maintaining a sophisticated potato barn is not very cheap. And so the maintenance projections for land and infrastructure the state holds has a massive range and is really unpredictable. Also identified solar leasing as a potential use here. Again, we would have to sort of review it on a parcel by parcel basis. If there's connectivity, great. We'd encourage the farmer at the front end that maybe they want to explore solar leasing because we were concerned about the state buying land and then making money off it, being a scenario that we don't really want to get into. But yeah, a lot of different potential ways for property to be used moving forward.
I just want to add one thing. As part of the acquisition of the property, the state would work with DEP's VRAP program, a voluntary remediation. I'm not getting that right.
Response action program.
Thank you.
Don't ask me why it's called that.
So, and that the department will do an environmental assessment. We know already there's PFAS on the property. They'll determine if there are other hazards of concern. And there will be a covenant on the lease, that document recorded in the registry of deeds that says, this is the character of the property, this is what is allowed here, this is what is not allowed here. So that then when DACF owns this property and is deciding what to do, if we sell it down the road, that covenant with the restrictions will go with the property. So that will provide some limitations on how it can be used in the future.
From a future forward perspective, if science changes, we have strategies to mediate PFAS from soil. Will we have triggers in this, what I'm envisioning is like a probate hearing for PFAS contaminated properties that the state out, these annual periodic hearings or whatever? Would you then be able to revisit that covenant?
Yes, yep, it's flexible over time based on changing conditions on the ground and advances in scientific knowledge.
And I think that's a good way to frame it, like whenever a property is up for review or discussion, the state could have this sort of tier list of intended uses, with the top being active agricultural production and the bottom being, I don't know what the bottom is. We could discuss it, but somewhere between the top and the bottom, outdoor recreation, habitat management, and sort of work through the line. Is the property suitable for ag production? Great, let's put it on the market. Is it not? Let's move to the next one. Let's move to the next one.
I guess I was just curious in the budget section about like with an experiment station, is the $250,000 annually? Is that for I'm just trying to get the difference between the different components of what we've got going on here. There's like the research part of there's a research subcommittee, then I'm just curious, the 250 is like, just like the physical maintenance? What is that?
So that's an approximation of what it is for operating and labor for our farms that we run through the university.
And you're saying operating like the actual programs or operating like maintaining the buildings?
Maintaining the buildings in the fields, there's no depreciation. It's probably a very, very low estimate.
Okay, so.
And it depends then on the crop or the focus, so our dairy program is expensive. We talked about a vegetable focused research station.
Jen?
Has there been any consideration for people who, like in our case, where we're gonna retain our land, but it clearly is worth less now, like on the real estate market? So I've lost an equity within my business. Is there any consideration in this for making payments to agricultural landowners that are gonna retain and manage it, but also understand that in 20 years when I want to retire and possibly sell my place, that I would end up with a reduction in value?
Do we discuss that?
We did in the context of appraised value and whether there is a reliable way to determine that diminution in value, and the appraiser on our on the land subcommittee really said no, because the markets change year to year, and I guess on other projects he's worked on, it's always what is the fair market value of today, given comparable sales, given development pressures, et cetera. It really would be speculative.
The changing value, so it's tough to
Right.
compensate.
Right.
And if remediation is a viable path forward in 20 years when you sell your property, then an equity payment from the state now would be irrelevant, right? Like if you're losing value now, but in 20 years, that value is just as high as it was before because we figured out how to clean this up, then that payment of the difference between contaminated and uncontaminated,
You think might disappear by the.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible.
I mean, 20 years is a long time to sit on money. I mean, you do a discounted cash flow analysis on that, and it's, you want the money now, right?
Yeah.
I'm just, may I just ask a question? So one of the things that I'm thinking about here is, $19,500,000, if that's deployed for this purpose, we're wrapping up $19,500,000, and we're buying assets with that. And those assets, we don't know what the value is. It seems to me that we want to churn those as quickly as possible and get the whatever value that is back into the other aspects of the remediation and relief that we're creating here, rather than sit on value. I mean, that's a third of the fund, right? I mean, it's like, okay. It seems to me that there should be an urgency to get that money working. I mean, it's working to some extent, but if that 19.5 buys what is appraised at $10 million of assets, there's $10 million there that we could be putting into other parts of the program that we're creating. So
Yeah, I guess I'd add that the value of those soils needs to be accounted for too. And that because if protecting those soils becomes a casualty of churn to animate more dollars to put back into the program, then we're losing something beyond the cash that's being held out.
Sure, if it just makes just follow up, I get that, and I understand the value in like not just like turning over the market at a discounted rate. Some conditionalities there. But I guess if you laid out the options, and I would have a sense of urgency about monetizing that. You know, maybe keeping in agriculture if possible, you know, foreseeing all that, but just like get that money back and redeploy it where it's needed.
Can I just make a comment? And I didn't quite hear everything you said, so I apologize. And maybe this was mentioned just now. You know, it is the intent, you know, to retain this, keep this property that the state buys in ag production. So, you know, I understand what you're saying, you know, to, you know, not to hold land because that money could be used elsewhere if we were to resell it. But if it buys us a little bit of time to learn more on how we can keep this land in production, you know, that's beneficial too, as opposed to selling it quickly to non-ag use. So that's kind of, you know, we were kind of thinking, trying to look at both sides, right? The intent is to keep as much land in ag production for the future as we can, but not so long that state's losing money too. Does that make sense?
But point taken too, right? If an option to sell that achieves that goal of keeping ag land in ag arises and we can be confident about the safety and efficacy of that return to production, then by all means, get it out the door.
I only statement of that too, and just a question for the whole group, but I do also think that part of the intention of the amount of money that was allocated for this fund was in recognition that we would be probably purchasing land, right? And so just like, I hear you. I think the more money that can be in this fund, be actively being able to be used should be prioritized, but also isn't part of the $60 million was recognizing that there was going to be this like this ultimately selling and purchasing a piece of land that may or may not have a good use.
I think I feel the same way about this. Is it like in order to flip it, if there was a reasonable way to have agriculture on the property, that farmer may have stayed there. And so recognizing that this is buying like the most contaminated of places with no path forward, it seems like a possible course of last resort, although it could be someone's first choice out of the gate, but it seems like holding some of these places is just going to take a while to figure out how to handle the soil condition. And so I would say that some of these we may hold for 4, 5, 6 years just to, hey, we haven't finished the work of developing all these programs, this is that, and then we have to actually go out and purchase these places and hold them. I mean, I think 3 to 5 years would be a fast turnaround on flipping a property. I also don't think this is a choice any farmer wants to take. You know, that's the bummer. Like, yeah.
I just want to offer, there are farmers that have no other option left at this point. So this opportunity has to be there without an ROI for the state or the taxpayers. It is about preserving the food system and providing a safety net. So it's tough to look at it that way when we're looking at money. It's hard for anybody here who's in business to do that or stewarding funds from the taxpayers. But I think we have to be very cognizant of that. And like they've articulated, there are so many other options that if someone is left with this option only, or it's the one that works for them, then because they are the downstream victim, this option has to stand.
If I just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting not doing it. I'm just saying that it's an observation that, you know, once the state owns that land, there's gonna be lots of pressures for the state to do things with that land. And I just think we should be intentional about the purpose of this fund and making sure that whatever the benefits are, is helping the people who've been harmed by the problem.
I think we've done a really good job of laying out some of those intentions.
And I think one thing we should recognize is that there are some extremely highly contaminated farms in this state. I mean, there are wildlife that are being affected by the high levels on some of these farms. So there are going to be properties that we aren't going to want to use for, you know.
I think I'll have you keep on going and then we'll take a little break,
Great.
5 minutes.
This is an alternative model to compensate a landowner that doesn't want to sell the farm, but to acknowledge that their lives and livelihood have still been impacted. So essentially it's paying farmers to adopt conservation practices and take their land out of production on an annual basis. There is, our loose idea would involve creating a menu of conservation practices that farmers could choose from. We'll pay you X dollars an acre to plant perennial forage crops. We'll plant you X dollars an acre to encourage carbon sequestration through any of the measures in the Healthy Soils Program or NRCS conservation plan. So with the idea of adding up to something around the average rental rate or more, as published by the department, acknowledging that the rental rate is income that a landowner would get without incurring any costs of operation. So trying to use that as the baseline and then compensate farmers for the costs that they'd accrue by managing a piece of land in a certain way. The FSA's Conservation Reserve Program does this, not on contaminated land, but it also pays peanuts. So we would have to use that model and create a sort of viable option for farmers that don't want to move but can't farm anymore and try to accomplish some broader conservation or carbon sequestration goals at the same time. There are complications to this, like don't want to invite endangered migratory birds to a farm if they're just going to get really sick. So the list of conservation practices that we might encourage farmers to adopt is smaller than the other sort of suite of conservation practices. And the farmer would have to make a really tough choice. Do they want to keep mowing or planting in soils that are potentially risks to themselves and their family, but wanted to recognize that this might be a pathway that people want to take and build something out for that.
What's the NRCS's relationship with PFAS? How do they feel about programs and stuff, putting money into land that?
Their position is evolving.
Sweet.
But this program wouldn't rely on any NRCS funding. This will be funded through the fund with technical assistance provided by their conservationists and other department staff.
Thank you.
Cool. And then Beth was going to talk about the sort of, or Sherry was going to talk about the guidance element.
Yes, thank you, Alex. So the fourth strategy that we talked about was providing information and guidance on buying or selling agricultural lands that have had sludge or septage applied. I think another subcommittee is working on the response kit as well. That would be sent out to farmers and landowners who have known PFAS contamination. So in conjunction with that, we want to be able to provide information to the professional, like appraisers, realtors, lenders, municipal offices, and maybe even do like seminars or informational meetings. Like DEP recently did a presentation, I believe, to the Maine Association of Realtors regarding PFAS. So in addition to material that we can hand out or have online, set up meetings and informational meetings for the public to attend. And the information that we come up with for this would be included in that response kit. So in addition to the basic PFAS information, we could provide links to the DEP information, to DHHS program information, include residential property disclosures. And when we have a final summary, a good summary of the land purchase process, include that in the package as well. So people would have that information up front. What else do I have listed there? A main farm link, any links to information that might be helpful to a landowner that finds themselves, in this situation. And again, including IRS and tax information as well. So just try to do like a one-stop shop. So at least, the first round of information landowners and farmers would be able to, find information or where to go to get additional information. So I don't know if, before I got on today, if you guys already just talked about the response kit that was being developed by a different committee.
We did.
Was that a yes?
Yes.
Yeah, the
financial and business support
Okay,
committee. So this would be part of that.
right.
Maybe just to underscore the value of having a navigator or advocate, that came up in this process too, because transactions are complicated, and to have somebody guiding farms through a very complicated transaction would be really helpful. We also talked about securing sort of external legal advice for the farmer as they pursue it, and how we could build relationships with the Conservation Law Foundation and other sort of networks of attorneys that might be helpful here.
Yeah, as far as budget goes for this part, there's a note in here, in the draft that, by the use of existing state of Maine staff, it shouldn't be, should be minimal to help develop and deliver educational materials. And there is our slide for the total budget for the land.
Yes, you'll have to be fast.
Now we know how much more.
We don't know. Ryan, are you leaving us in our research conversation?
I am, yes, I am.
Justin and Noah.
All right, so, well, and I want to make sure Amanda gave me a call, so she might want to, but I'll start us off. So Amanda, if you're on, please let me know when you want to interject.
I'm here. Thank you. I'll let Dean Rowland take the lead here, and I'll add on if there's anything she doesn't cover, but I imagine she'll be very thorough.
Okay, thank you. Sounds good. So you have the membership listed there. I would again thank everyone, like Sherry did, reiterate, people worked really hard, spent a lot of time, wonderful discussions, lots and lots of notes, and learned a lot. So thanks to everyone who served on the subcommittee. We came down with 3 basic areas of recommendations. One was,
Mouse to the right.
okay. I need to get rid of this. One was a competitive research grant program. I think that was sort of something that was assumed would be discussed. That came down to a couple of different flavors that we'll talk about. The other was in association with the land committee, talking about research station establishment. This came out relatively early in the discussion, thinking through for the types of topics that need to be researched, and you'll see that in your report. Pages 43 and 44, some of the topics that we discussed. To be able to research those topics is going to take an area of land that is sort of set up experimentally to collect that data. And unfortunately, as Kish and I were just discussing, some of the affected farms actually have those conditions now set up. So the potential for making them into research stations is really high. We currently just finished an agreement with a farmer where we're gonna have 8 to 9, I think, people that are gonna go out and do research on crops, soils, even animals. And unfortunately, the conditions of the farm were well suited for the types of questions that we needed to research and collect data on experimentally over a 2 to 3 year period. So I want to reiterate, I think the value, the ROI of maybe some of the farms that could be purchased by the state. Research is certainly one of those, because I would never be able to go into our humane experiment stations and set up those types of conditions. So, the last one was a discussion in general. This was part of the roadmap about repository for data and scientific information. This took on sort of two flavors. One was the ability to look to the literature and find the studies that had currently been done, and then looking into the future, if the fund supports research, where those papers and publications and information might be deposited. And so that's one need. The second is actual database, thinking through that there might be standards of data collection, for example, location, soil conditions, time of year, who collected, those sorts of things would go into a large database that then could be used for using machine learning and other sorts of data analysis tools in the future. And so having that repository where people could access that data, use it for different questions that come up into the future. This is one of those scientific issues, I think, that we don't even know the right questions to ask at this point. And so having that data on hand where we can go back after we've learned something to be able to query that data is really good. So that kind of took on two flavors. There's our proposed research budget, and so you can see it broken out on page 42 amongst the three categories. And so I just thought I would summarize some of the discussion, starting with the competitive grants programs. And this is, as I mentioned, topics on pages 43 and 44, and there's a summary on page 46. Multi-year projects, we determined that that was pretty important. So that would be something, an animal project, or you can take a agronomic project that might be looking at, so an example is a variety of crops that might be tested over 2 to 3 years to determine if they're able to remediate areas of soil, how safe do they stay, are there certain times during their development that they could be harvested and used without any danger, those sorts of issues. How is PFAS moving through the soil? How does the microbiome affect all of that? How do the microorganisms, do they move it through the soil? For animals, we've got some researchers that are looking at binders, for example. So following the binder performance over time in animals. Those would be these large scale multi-year projects that would be really important to get the experimental data. We've got a lot of observational data that is informing some of the decisions, but we want to make sure that we follow that up with experimental data to confirm what we're finding, that is definitely the case, and to guide us then into the next kinds of questions we should ask. We currently have a set of projects that are going through using sort of this similar approach and having similar questions. They will be done on farm at this farm that I just mentioned. And they are roughly 500, we have a budget of about 500,000, and the duration is probably 2 to 3 years. And that is because certainly for field scale research, you're going to have years that differ absolutely. And so to be able to statistically confirm your findings, you have to repeat the study to make it publishable, but also to ensure that the results that you have are accurate to any recommendations that come out of it. So that is the bulk of it. Then we had a discussion about smaller scale. We didn't want to discourage people from submitting proposals or projects that might be small, that might be a year long, that the question might be able to be answered in a year. And so the discussion was around small scale projects not to exceed 250,000. They might be completed within an 18-month time period. And we had some discussion about small scale projects, but also rapid response questions. They might fall within this sort of scheme. These small scale projects, we were talking about a quarterly review, I think, Beth. And so that lends itself to rapid response projects where something might come up. Keisha has maybe an example. Do you want to share?
Sure. For example, last year, our sheep flock was highly contaminated with PFAS, and it was an opportunity to take samples and gain some information, which we unfortunately didn't do. But that's something that could have fallen into a rapid response type study and gained some information in an area that there currently isn't any information.
So actually, we've kind of discussed three types. So that would be, these large multi-year projects, and then under small scale, that could certainly be a smaller project that's designed that way, and then possibly a rapid response is something that we all discussed. Are there any questions on that portion? There were details in the group. Oh,
Thank you.
Sorry, for the members, you're discussing members of who would be reviewing those grant proposals?
Sorry, no, that's members
Great,
of the subcommittee.
My question is relating to who would be reviewing.
So we didn't decide what that structure looked like. We discussed it. And so the idea of making sure that we take into account conflict of interest for members that might be on a review panel that might also represent organizations that were submitting proposals. There were several ideas that were put through about there might be sort of an initial review, and then the state would do the final recommendations and review. But we did not decide what that structure, review structure looks like. We talked also about what the request for proposals might look like, what information would need to be submitted in a proposal, but we didn't finalize that structure.
I'm curious about, I know in the report it says that you have to introduce yourself. I'm not sure all the members of the group. Sorry, yes, I'm Mariam Talib. I'm working with MAFCA and kind of representing a lot of our PFAS work.
She's on the financial and business support subcommittee.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was curious, thank you. Absolutely. Sorry, in the notes, it says that potentially including a farmer or representative of agricultural community. I think one of my questions is how do we make sure that we're including, being really intentional about broadening how many farmers are finding ways to communicate with this granting program and providing kind of feedback and ideas without necessarily having to collaborate, and making sure that we're incentivizing not just the same collaborations, but new ones. I think that's kind of what I wanted to question about.
Well, I was gonna say, and I appreciate that, and I think that's a question maybe to bring for public comment at the public hearing.
Well, that's great.
Just so it's helpful in the advisory committee structure, advisory committee members are participating, and as not a member of the committee, you're essentially the public, and so we open up a door when we start letting the public comment during an advisory committee meeting or ask questions. So it's a very valid and appropriate question, but it's just that we have to maintain the structure, otherwise there becomes questions around fairness.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Becca has a question.
I know I'm listed on this subcommittee, but I don't think I was able to make it to one meeting. So Beth, it probably should be taken off that list. I just had a question. I wasn't sure if this came up in one of your conversations, and I'll be honest that it's not something I know very much about, but I did find it interesting. And that was an article about a farm in Maine. I think it was on a tribal farm that was using hemp to clean the soil. And I use that word very loosely in terms of cleaning the soil. But was that something that came up, and is that another opportunity to look at that type of crop? And I just, like I said, I don't know very much about it, but it did seem like the experiment research station could be a useful exploration of that.
So Becca, on page 43, that was discussed in general, so we didn't go into real specifics, like for given projects that might end up being called for in the request for proposals, but that certainly is an area that was determined to be really important. Not necessarily just hemp focused, but certainly the sequestration idea of different crops. So yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
I think we put forward looks great. I just had a question about, had you considered, one thing when I think of especially the small scale grant projects, and just a question that I have related to the structure of like who's putting out in general the RFPs for grants and stuff. Have you considered all of the like SARE grant program at all or farmer-led research? Because one concern I have is like, where do the interests of the impacted farmers as their discovery of figuring out the thing that the information that they really want and finding ways for that to line up with what a researcher wants to do and how those things may or may not work. Whereas like this fund is also, the goal is to support not just the broad agricultural community and like research, but also hopefully research that's really helping the impacted farmers that are currently experiencing this in Maine. So like how to balance that with like finding research that is useful to ag as a whole, but also like really useful to the farms that are currently dealing with this in Maine.
There was a lot of thoughtful discussion and really focus on making sure that the request for proposals was done such as a co-creative process. There's also discussion about having the public hearing being a point where at the trade show where we would take public comment about what should go into the RFP for that particular year. So none of that was like nailed down, but that's absolutely going to be has to be a component. And it has to be research that's going to lead to solutions, relevant solutions for farmers. So that was definitely a core piece of the discussion. Cool.
One question about the dissemination of information.
I haven't quite gotten there yet. I have other details, but go ahead. Oh, wait. Okay. So on the experiment station, this portion on page 47 is talking about that idea. And there was definitely a group within the subcommittee that said this would have great value. And again, for me, thinking about running our 5 experiment stations, station farms at the University of Maine, we've already had this discussion about how we would set up PFAS research at those experiment stations, and we wouldn't be able to do it. And so those on-farm opportunities are key and critical. And so interfacing with the land committee, figuring out if there was a way in which to have one or maybe more affected farms have that ability to do research on farm would be essential. And that might be an experiment station process, might not. I know there's a experiment station history, right, Nancy, through DACF. And so I pulled together my budgets for the 5 farms, and we took a rough guess about what it takes to operate those farms. And that's where we have the 250,000, which I think is a underestimate of what it would actually take. We also know that there would be probably quite a bit of equipment outlay that would be needed to put in place depending on what was available at the farm to begin with. You know, setting up some of the infrastructure and structure for the research itself, and then what the depreciation would be for the equipment.
I have a question about the research station, and this will show like how little I actually know about sort of funding streams and how these projects are put together. Is it possible, or would it be because I'm thinking about like stretching, right, stretching the funding. Are there other opportunities to partner with other funders on something like this, or does it have to come just from one place?
Great question, and that's my other hat is working really hard with our researchers to find other funds that match these funds. And I view this as, this is not going to drive the university's research mission. This is going to go hand in hand with the federal funds that all of the faculty are, they got proposals in. We're looking at every possible place for funding. So I completely agree. There are infrastructure funds, they tend to be limited. There are, for example, there's a small infrastructure fund even through NSF that there are really relevant questions that we're asking here that the National Science Foundation would be interested in. But I think you're absolutely right. There is great potential for looking for matching funds.
I so appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Just for clarification, is the committee proposing that, the subcommittee proposing that the administration of this research facility would be kind of because I'm trying to figure out who's juggling logistics. Is the concept that like someone like UMaine would actually be the managing the research station, or is this fund, like who's managing this research station, I guess, and like what is the vision there, like the realities of like the logistics and all of that?
The discussion we had really, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard was focused around the state actually owning and managing. I think there are lots of different models that could come out of that, including, like I said, this agreement that we have with a farmer. They may be a part of that, right? We are providing funding to them to help with the management and running of the research project. So I think there's a range of models that would work there.
That was my question.
That was your question.
Yeah. Thanks.
And the budget we put forward was for one research.
Right.
Definitely there's potential to have more, but within the scope of this, we had budgeted just for one.
And when you start to kind of play this out for the college in your mind, do you see there being this being a research area that entices the interest of researchers to come and join UMaine?
Oh yeah, we're already seeing programs pivot quite heavily. Yeah, so yes, and there are several positions that we may be able to fill that are coming up that I would likely focus a portion of that towards PFAS in our description of that position.
Thanks.
Any other questions on that part? Okay, so the repository, do I ask your question now?
No, it may be answered in your explanation.
So like I said, we had sort of two tracks here that we discussed that are a little bit intermingled periodically, but we started off with the idea of the Shaw Institute is already sort of collecting papers and reference articles, and that might be an opportunity to share more broadly. We have that within the experiment station where as people are doing searches, we're collecting those references. At this point, we just talked about it being a bibliography, so just the citation for those references and not the reference itself, because then you can run into all kinds of copyright issues and those sorts of things. But at least having a repository for researchers who are newly getting into this space, they would be able to look through that and try to get up to speed. and then a way in which the fund supported projects, if they lead to a publication, a fact sheet or something of that sort, those could also be put into this literature repository. And we estimated that we would likely be able to use existing structures that are in place, so not at a cost. The other piece, the other path that I think as putting my researcher hat on is going to be absolutely key is this sort of data repository that can be used as we begin to collect all of these data sources. How do we make it so that it's mineable and mineable into the future? And I think that's going to be really key. That is a much bigger lift. So you have to determine what are the minimum data standards? So what do you have to make sure that's in that data collection? You're looking for the quality of that data. You're assuring that that quality is where it needs to be to go into the database. Who houses it? Who manages it? Who maintains it? That's a much bigger question that we did not fully explore. I think the state is doing part of that now, I believe. But it may go beyond that. That answers your question.
It actually triggered a question. So when other researchers from other universities, independent organizations want to access a data repository of that nature, is there a cost?
It depends on the structure of that database. It just depends on, who would decide to do that. There might be a use cost, there might not, might be open access.
And was there any discussion about the sort of event that would happen that would bring lots of people to, like a conference of sorts annually that would, or biannually, some event that would allow for kind of a reveal of recent research and event?
Yes. So we've been working very closely with MFT in submitting an LOI. So I submitted an LOI to NIFA 2 or 3 months ago. It was accepted, and so we've been working to get it to the proposal stage. And just recently, 3 national program leaders reached out, said, hey, we have a similar one that might be going in. Can you collaborate? We said, sure, that would be great. So we were working towards collaborating. And at this point, we've revised the proposal draft and have not gotten a final yet from NIFA, whether that will be an acceptable structure to go through or not. But we are working hard to get a conference. We were hoping by the fall.
Sorry for all the questions. I guess my biggest thing with the money from this fund being oriented towards grants, which I think is great, is just also related to with this being such a, it's not new, but a new field. And farmers having to make decisions on the ground all the time about things that they're doing. It's just, is there a way to build into this, not just like I think it could drive me crazy if I knew down the road there was a research program going on where there's all this data being collected on stuff that I might love to know, but I'm not going to get the data information until like a year later when that publication is finalized. How could there be ways through this research, through doing the research that's, even if it's not conclusive data, but like it's been really helpful for me to get, like I've talked to Duncan about like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What have you heard? You know, even just getting the anecdotal information of like, oh, like we've seen from our test that this might be a safe path forward. Like, how do we like create ways that farmers can help have access to the information, even if it's not like complete and conclusive, but like helping with decision making?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is through the state and through cooperative extension, right? But so I've been a researcher for 20 years myself. I think we need to be careful, right? Because there are a lot of we can make recommendations that then get overturned. And so I would want to make sure that we're saying things like, this is anecdotal, we don't know, you know, we really need to confirm. That's my own bias. So I just felt like if I don't say it now.
Yeah.
So I would want us to be really careful about what we say is truly informational and what's backed by research.
Yeah.
And so I think that it seems to be everybody seems to be very supportive and open to providing the information that is gathered on the ground nearly immediately to people, which I think that's great. And I wouldn't envision that being changing anything with this. I think the other thing is that the small scale and the rapid response were ways in which that information could really flow. If we're doing a quarterly review and those are occurring quickly, then we would envision that information would get out very quickly.
It would get out, and then that would get communicated out broadly.
Right.
I think we discussed all of the information from the research going through the ACF, so they would have all of the information from any research that was funded by the fund.
Thank you.
So, the health subcommittee is working on 8 strategies. 4, I would say, are just about finalized, and the other 4, we haven't had an opportunity to discuss as a group. So I think rather than jumping into health, I would like to hold that conversation until May 10th. Unless Becca, do you want to add anything?
Nope, I agree with you. I think waiting until next week makes sense.
So, talk about next steps. Meet again in 10 days to review health subcommittee's recommendations. And then the public hearing is June 12th. It's scheduled to be in the next building down the hill, Marquardt, from 1 to 4 on a Monday afternoon again. This will be an opportunity for us to listen to public comments. I will also be working with the department's webmaster to get a version of this up online so that people can submit written comments. After that, we'll need to meet again to finalize the plan. I'm thinking July 10 is the most realistic date. These dates were sort of constrained by where I could find meeting space. So I have rooms reserved for July 10 and June 26. June 26 doesn't allow an awful lot of time. So if the public hearing is the 12th, if I leave the online version up for a week until the 19th, that gives just 1 week for me to compile everything and then you all to digest it. And that seems like that might be much. And then we're into the 4th of July holiday. So I think on July 10th it makes sense to come together to finalize the plan. We want to talk about the process for how we do that. Or do we want to wait till we have the feedback from hearing first?
It might be good to sort of set expectations so that we're not just coming in on July 10th after the public hearing blind, not really knowing what the expectations are. It's just sort of like a knee-jerk reaction.
Right.
So if you're looking for thoughts about how you want that to work.
And this is not about this subject, but I just want to make sure that we do discuss at some point the public hearing. Last time there was concerns about placement where the cameras were. I think it's important for the public that is not there to be carried, to be able to get that information. But if we could ensure that the cameras would be in a space that would not be confronting to anyone wishing to speak. I think that was concerning for some.
Like a press section.
Right, yeah, like if they could shoot from the back and then let people face us and have their back too. I think that's generally how every public hearing is generally shot anyways. But that was a really big concern for some of the folks who had important testimony to provide.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think ahead of time, if we can make sure folks know that written comment is available to them. I think that's super important if folks aren't comfortable being there in person. But it's a challenge, right? Because it's a public hearing. So.
Right, but having the camera facing you was the issue, which I don't think anyone intended it to be an issue. So I think if we just make sure that the cameras are in the back of the room like they usually are, and they're addressing us one way or the other, or I think that's, when I think about school boards and stuff, that's how I generally see that sort of thing.
And these were TV cameras? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it wasn't Zoom, it was the TV camera.
Missed that whole thing for COVID.
I think just having them in the front, like right in front of where I was as a committee member was like completely intimidating too.
It was odd, and I get why they were there. It was a very large room, but Marquardt has its own je ne sais quoi. So I feel that if preserving a space for press would be really the best way to make sure that the coverage is there and the communication is truly a public hearing, but just not having the camera facing right at someone having to speak.
We want people to be comfortable.
Yeah.
There's a big closet in that room. We keep doing that.
I didn't say that at all. Long live the fourth estate.
In the legislature, we always hesitate to have any press behind the horseshoe because they get in and look at your notes.
Right.
And that's kind of, it feels a little bit like a privacy violation because you're running your thoughts out, not necessarily for public consumption.
So I guess we're figuring out where the public would be and seeing how that affects our horseshoe is I guess looking at that room, maybe suspending them from the ceiling somewhere.
Yeah, and it's not as big a room as this, so we'll give some thought to.
Yeah. If they're behind the public, perhaps that will give enough space to preserve what we're doing, but.
And if it's successfully streamed, that might be adequate.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump.
No, that's important. It is important because the whole goal is to hear from the people that are impacted by the decision, by the report and the plan that we put out. So.
Yeah, so I appreciate everybody's thoughtful comments today. I feel like I didn't hear anything that should be struck from this initial draft. Is that correct?
For 18 million. Except for 18 million?
Well, yeah, that, but the concepts of, and I think actually if you sort of look at the total per subject area, the most is direct assistance to farmers, then land purchases. Say the health budget seems very modest to me, given the importance of it. That's 5.4 million. It's 10 million. So it just worked out that the order that. So as I've been thinking, like, how do we pull all this together? I just assigned the financial and business support group number 1 and the land group number 2, research 3 and health 4. And sort of the budget ended up falling sort of in that same order. Not that any one is less priority because I think they work together as a whole, but in terms of the dollar amounts per section, that's sort of how it works out. So yes, we either have to scale back on time or money, but at this point, I didn't hear that we should take any ideas off the table at this point. I guess that's what I want to confirm. Okay, head nods. All right, so we meet again May 10th. To dive into health and prep for the public hearing.
Can I ask one quick question? Just related to public hearing and the request, sending out the opportunity for people to have public comment. Is there a way, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that there's a public hearing and then in theory, we're gonna meet one time after that and somehow finalize a plan after getting whatever public comment we get. And if we really want to take that public comment seriously, plus we're trying to finalize a plan in one meeting, I'm a little concerned about that. And just wondering if at least the written public comment, and if there's a way for us to kind of get that and start digesting it before, like if, like as it comes in as a committee somehow, or I don't know, like just wondering how we're gonna.
Yeah.
Or do you anticipate that we'll have 2 meetings after?
So I agree with you that one meeting may not be enough, but until we have the public input, it's, it's hard to say. I will certainly get you a written document ahead of the July 10th meeting, which is all the more reason not to meet on June 26th. I just think that even if I was able to digest and consolidate all the information, that doesn't give the committee time to really reflect on it and discuss.
When is the public hearing announced? Like, does the public already know about it?
Well, it's,
Sorry.
it's been kind of low-key announced.
Yeah.
We'll be doing press releases really after the May 10th. So when I have a final preliminary document. This document is on DACF's website at the moment, but obviously it doesn't include the health recommendations. So after our May 10th meeting, then we'll do a real blast, letting people know when, the details of the meeting, when the online version is going to be open for comment, all the details people need to know.
No, June is not a time I want to be in a meeting, but I just wonder if it'd be smart for us to have like short subcommittee meetings after the public hearing before our big advisory committee. Or I don't know, just to reflect on like that public hearing and then like, I'm just more trying to think about if there's a way to get close to finalizing the plan on the 10th, like what would that take and just like having a subcommittee Zoom in between those 2 things to reflect on that final.
It sounds like
I don't know.
General question. So we've laid out a plan for multiple years. I'm wondering, when I'm talking to farmers and they're asking me, but what if you see a change and a need to reprioritize or shift? How locked in are we to this? What does it entail for us to make changes based on the changes and the true application of the plan? Once we see it, what does that take an act of Congress or does it take an act of us?
So you said that of this advisory committee and the logistical thing within the department is, each quarter I let the financial folks how much I anticipate will be drawing from the fund, and that money is shifted into an account where it can be drawn from. So
this document breathes very well.
Yes.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Well, thank you all.
So
All
organized.
together.
one.
ended a little bit early, so.
Okay, Shaz.
I have
Oh, I'm sorry.
one last sort of unrelated question, but something that I don't feel like we've really addressed. And I'm just curious if this is the right place to address it or not, is funding, like tests that farmers want to do that are proactive. Farms who aren't like currently contaminated or don't have a current known contaminant. Is that something that we would do in the fund, or is that something that the department would do? Because if there are people who would like to know, but don't feel like they can spend lots of money on tests, how do we support that community?
So this is a sort of half response to that question, which is the department will reimburse people who self-test, including if they used a third-party consultant like a Northern Tilt or something like that, which is what we recommend for ag and the complexities. However, they have to share the information with us. And I think that can be a real impediment, understandably. I don't want to speak for MOFGA and MFT, but we have referred folks to them for their emergency response for that exact purpose. And I don't want to add redundancy if something is available there. We just need to do a better job letting folks know that that's a resource. And if that isn't enough or doesn't resolve the question, you know, what else could we do?
I guess my thoughts here was that if somebody wants to be testing, I almost feel like somebody should just be able to say, I'm a farmer. I'd like to test these things. Where do I go to have those funds available? And I hear that you're saying MOFGA is currently the place to go. I don't think that there's a problem with sharing the information with the department if the department is then providing the testing. Maybe it's a staffing issue. I don't know. I mean, I guess personally for me, we just recently wanted to test some new lands that we can be renting, and we kind of got some pushback, like, well, it's not on the sludge map, so we don't want to do the testing. And I just feel like the testing is something that should be available to everybody, no matter what. And maybe the fund isn't the place to make that happen, but how do we make that happen? And MOFGA is often thought of as, you know, for organic farmers, but this is not an organic farmer problem. This is something that should just be available. I guess I feel like the state should just provide testing. And I don't know how to make that happen. That's why I'm bringing it up.
The way that we started this whole process was by passing legislation that directed the DEP to test the sludge sites. And so that's how it's currently funded in sort of big picture.
Right. Which is sort of a slow way to get there for a lot of sites.
Yep.
And there are people who are wanting to be more proactive than that. And I feel like that's something that should be supported. Because it's the people that are being proactive that will help us get ahead.
I'm on board with this. I mean, this is like a really valid complaint. It's like, if you're a farmer, but you're not on a sludge. I mean, like, we didn't have spreading in our place.
I mean, wouldn't it
You know,
be great to just give the farmer a test and test their farm and find it's non-detect and be like, okay, this section is good. I mean, and then if you discover a problem, then drill down and do more testing. But it could actually save a lot of heartache and headache to just provide testing on a wider scale.
So we did discuss, or we've talked about what type of legislation would be needed, perhaps a legislation keyed in towards making sure we have the capacity for that testing, because we can't just do the test. But also making that availability. I know that the FRSAN grant that was available for testing was really beneficial to us. they asked, of course, I had to answer the questionnaire, has this improved your mental health? Yeah, I don't want to jump off the highest cliff anymore. Because most of the places we wanted to test were places where it wasn't an issue, but it was an issue, right?
Until you know it's an
Right,
issue.
right. If I have a landowner that says my well's hot or whatever they use for the word, and I'm like, how do I know if the field is okay and such? So perhaps what we need to pursue is legislation of that to make sure that all the pieces fit, because I don't know if there is a capacity for it, but right now your legislation is directed towards those sites, yes. So perhaps there's need for legislation towards the food production protection.
I don't necessarily think that there needs to be policy or legislation about it. I mean, I think to Keisha's point, and I think overarchingly we'd all agree, people proactively testing, regardless of whether or not they know there might be sludge that, or they don't know, there's a utility for that. We definitely know that because of the process by which DEP and thereby we are going down, there are people who are waiting and they don't want to wait much longer, so we've always been telling people, if you want to get a jump on this, you can go to MFT, you can go to MOFGA. They will help people who are conventional and as well. If you want us to reimburse you, you're just going to have to share the data with us. And we see there is a practical upside for that so that we continue to understand what else is out there and what the results are. I think where we have just sort of tried to balance as a bureau working with particular farms, there's sort of a gray area where we have provided a lot of testing for a lot of different things. And the question then becomes, do we continue to test on behalf of a farm going forward when it's an outgrowth of their operations now? It wasn't part of what they were using now, but they're looking to source new fields or whatnot. So right now we have tried to be sort of thoughtful about our resources about that. But at the same time, we understand why folks want to test, to say, hey, we'd like to take the extra 50 acres, hard to find 50 acres to do X, Y, and Z these days. We want to jump on it. We also want to know if there's PFAS on it. So I don't think it's a policy that we've set in stone or written up, but we're just trying to balance if people want to do due diligence on their own, there are outlets to do it beyond us right now. If you're a farm that's working with us and we've done a lot of testing to date, we need to talk about where you want to go in the future and whether or not it makes sense for us to be doing that. If you're at a place to do it on your own, and if you don't think that you are, then let's talk about that. So anyway, I know that was a really long answer. The last thing I think is more laws and.
Right, and I get that. I feel that you're doing a lot. I just don't know if any of us have answered what Kesha was saying. That's the problem.
It seems like the qualifier for any of this help is that you're contaminated. Right, that's like the first, you have to have this contamination to step into assistance as a farmer. So in this scenario, like I could just be walking into another assistance program if I go and lease more land, test it myself, find out it's super contaminated, I'm already involved in it now. And I'm just going back for more. Now I have to go back for more money to help me change on a piece of land I leased, and now like if you find out those 50 acres a year from now are not good, you're basically in the hole again and have to come back at it. It would be the same scenario for me, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my specific situation aside, I was looking at it from the point of view of somebody who just wants to get ahead of it and wants to know, and maybe doesn't have the funds to do all the testing. And I understand that MOFGA is currently filling that gap, but I feel like that should be the state's responsibility in some way, because the allowing of the sludge spreading in the first place was the state. So I feel like any farm should be able to get a test on. And yeah, maybe they won't be able to get like an in-depth testing like what's been done on some of the contaminated farms, but just a very basic, broad sample to
Our
know.
reimbursement model doesn't.
Because we could have stopped a lot of the issues had we done that sooner. And I feel like for the farmers who do want to be proactive, we should be providing that. And I know there are farmers who don't want to be proactive, and they can wait for DEP, that's fine.
Will you get reimbursed, does the farmer get reimbursed from the state if they test?
No, if you
and
test a
are
field
clean?
and it tests non-detect, you are not reimbursed. That is currently how it works.
Is it?
So it's quite a gamble for a farmer. And I will say, as much as I understand and I support them reporting the results, for some commodities, it is a very, very scary thing. And for some farmers who, the last thing they want to do is tell anybody anything. We have a couple here in the state. It can be problematic because it doesn't encourage that sort of proactiveness that we kind of want. I mean, because we are talking about a food system. So I just don't know what the answer is, but I see.
I mean, maybe we limit it to soil and water. Like just
To soil and the water,
Let's-
something simple.
let's just like find out the basics. If you somebody who's concerned, can they test their soil and their water? And get that
I have
reimbursed.
actually two questions now that we're talking about this, to help my understanding, because I'm not a farmer, and that is, what is the cost?
600 a test, roughly.
How many tests per farm?
I believe the state gets a better price because they're doing more of them. So that would be an advantage to going through the state, and it would be an advantage to go through the state because then it's all in a database and we don't have to retest it again.
And then where are we in terms of capacity for testing? I mean, that's the thing that from a couple years ago that I remember was the big problem, and I know we're standing up some testing in the state, but I'm not sure where that is in terms of capacity, and that may impact.
Well, for example, I think
I don't know what the
Northern-
turnaround
For example,
time
I
is.
think Northern Tilth has hired more staff, so it's, if we have more demand, we may have some wait time, but it will.
So maybe part of our work would be encouraging that preventative inspection that involves the reimbursement program, if that's promoting it doesn't overburden you. I mean, if your question originally was, how does it fit into this fund?
Does it or doesn't it, but
Yeah.
how do we address it, even if it doesn't fit into the fund?
Yeah, it doesn't fit into the fund because it doesn't meet eligibility, but.
Because you're not contaminated yet, so you don't need
Yes,
the fund
And
eligibility.
or, thank you very much for
You're
the
not
and or.
knowingly contaminated yet.
Yes.
Right.
So this is all really helpful feedback, and I do have to just start by saying this was how we started a year ago.
Yeah.
And we really wanted there to be A, the requirement that people share, and B, that they be contaminated so that we then start working with the farms. The flip side that we all agree on is we still want people to be testing to answer those questions. And get the good news, hopefully, that there's not much or nothing to worry about. There's some more labs, there's at least 1 to 2 that are coming online. I'm gonna put you on the spot, that are soil and water specific. They're not doing much media beyond that. So there could be more lab capacity in the state now already that could maybe turn things around more quickly.
I think they're still about a year away.
Oh,
Yeah,
shoot.
Well, it might be shorter, might be 6 months, but they're buying
Right.
equipment, and getting certified.
I mean, could the next iteration of the Bureau of Ag's department's policy for reimbursement be, you still have to report, but we'll reimburse regardless of the result? Is that the solution that you think might?
I think that would help
Yes.
farmers be more proactive with testing.
And maybe give a better forecast to the amount of money needed in the future. Like if you're just continuously testing farms that are fine, the budget may need to be revised a little bit to meet that. Or if we know that all of a sudden, holy cow, finding way more soil than we thought, we may need more. It might help us forecast the next 5 or 6 years of spending.
Well, and could also on the flip side validate that we have a lot of clean soil in Maine.
True.
Well, I think that's something that would be really valuable to know is I want to know where the good soil is too. I don't want to just know where all the bad soil
And it
is.
would also increase the actual knowledge base of the people who are very much affected. If farmers are involved in the testing and they're exposed to the information and the resources that you all provide, that would be a very good thing. That would be a real big lift that I think we can't reach with a mailer or a Facebook post or something.
Right.
Well, I mean, so first and foremost, you probably want to know the water, right? If there's irrigation, you want to make sure your irrigation is going to be. I don't know that there is a first or a second with water and soil because they can be so independent.
Depends
But
on.
I mean, would you have even known if you hadn't tested, like it wasn't either, it was like actually
It's
the
not in
animal
our
first.
water.
Right, but I mean, like the first way you discovered was from your actual milk, right? So like,
We first got concerned when we
bought that
found out about the water tests of our
neighbors, right? I guess I'm more just thinking like, are there plenty of situations where like you might have a clean, you might need to test like like the livestock or like the milk before even worrying about the land, or is it always gonna be land or water first?
Land, water, or feed.
Yeah.
I feel like the soil and the water is the most
Yeah.
important. I mean, yes,
Yeah.
the milk sample is how we discovered everything that was going on
Yeah.
at our place.
Yeah.
But I feel like the water and the soil would be the most important
Yeah.
fund.
if you're expanding into in your example.
Even
of
if you're
moving-
just a farmer who wants to find out,
Yeah.
Right, but in your initial example of wanting to move to the next field or expand into another field.
well, in our particular situation, we're losing about 30 acres to solar panels that's non-detect soil. So we're looking to find other land to replace that with. But now knowing what we know and how sensitive dairy cows are to PFAS, we don't want to sign a lease with somebody until we know what the soil is. Yes.
Okay, so the policy as we crafted it again over a year ago was that you either had a history of sludge, but you were kind of low on the tier, or you were adjacent or near. So basically what you're saying is if you want to know, it doesn't matter.
I feel like if you want to know, you should be allowed to test, and that should be paid for by the state. That's my personal feelings,
Regardless of the results.
regardless of the results.
Based on that it was not
Because
our
I feel
choice.
like it would be valuable to the whole state of Maine to know what our soil levels are, whether they're contaminated or not, and that will just add to the database, the farmers that are wanting to be proactive.
Would you then need a threshold? Like right now, the threshold's like you have to be at like $2,000 threshold. Is that what we would have, that would, what you would use? Is it?
I mean, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. To follow whatever the current standards are for that.
7,000 operations roughly. Qualify at that $2,000 level.
Yeah.
So that's like 4.25 million just for one sample. So if you're gonna do two, it's something like 8 million. 400.
And I think for soil, I mean, one 10-acre field is not one sample.
You also have a lot of farms and soils that are already tested.
And for dairy and livestock, dairy farms especially, the more judicious test would be testing the milk to see if there is an issue. If there isn't an issue with the milk, then perhaps there isn't a necessity to test other areas.
Okay, but in my
Right,
situation,
but
the milk was tested by the state off the shelf. We didn't know. We
Right.
did not have a problem. We bought in feed from a field that was not tested and was not on the map.
Right.
And that's what caused our problem.
Right.
So ideally, we would start getting the information of where this all is and stop spreading it sooner rather than later. And I feel like people who are wanting to be proactive should have the resources to be proactive.
Yes, I was just speaking to the fact to her calculations. I mean,
Of the
even if we
milk.
just did one field, I myself would have eaten up most of that budget just by one field, by doing it field by field testing. And I don't know if that would be well worth the, if none of them have been spread with sludge. That's, that's what I'm saying, because
I guess what
if,
I was proposing was
Knowing
like a
these-
whole, like, for example, there's a farm that we're working with that I believe.
I don't think there's any
the
problem with
state
what you're
ended up
proposing.
doing 4 or 5 different samples on that farm, where
Yeah.
one across the whole property would have sufficed.
Right.
So I guess what I was proposing was a broad, not field by field, but
Right, no, and I'm just adding to it that I'm wondering, is it just soil and water that would be reimbursable, or would it also be like direct from the tank?
I have to underscore what Keisha was saying in that the milk is one data point in time, and it depends on where that feed is coming from, at
Right.
what point in the year. Sometimes if we had tested 3 months prior, you would have been non-detect.
Okay.
So I think to the point of understanding, is there PFAS in the soil or the groundwater? Everything from there. I'm not saying no forever and ever, but I do think that the granular data is really helpful. And a composite sample is gonna give more assurance than just, one random sample. So I'm happy to, take all of this back and sort of rethink the reimbursement. I definitely see, and I think we all agree, there's utility for finding the clean as well as the contaminated fields. But the resource and the budget have to kind of be assessed in order to make changes. But yeah, we
I
don't.
also don't think that every farm in the state is gonna suddenly step forward and want testing.
Right.
I just think that there are people who wanna be proactive and don't necessarily have the resources to be.
No, I totally feel that.
Miriam, can I ask, are you guys getting requests at a pretty steady beat, or especially now that it's field season?
We are starting to ramp up again. A lot of it is people looking for more proactive. They would like to just know if their wells are good to go. This is people, a lot of our requests right now, it's a little bit of like a loose connection between what risk they think there is kind of tripping this, and it makes me feel like some people are trying to be proactive and then like find a way to describe a reason that they should be getting a test. And I think that that speaks to this need. But a lot of it is we say yes for the water test and it comes back non-detect, and they just get to go on breathing a little easier, and that feels so worth it. And so we've been, getting a lot of those kinds of requests and feeling really good about also the risk that it doesn't fit within DACF's reimbursable costs and kind of taking that on, but it would be a help to be able to say yes to more and advertise that more.
I think the more research I do about our situation is that I'm realizing there's a lot of off-license spreading that occurred in our neighborhood that was,
Sharing,
huh?
a lot of sharing.
A lot of sharing, yeah, and like, I think what Keisha's saying is important, because just because I wasn't on a map, like that didn't make, the well is, contaminated, but I think I've discovered why, so had I known that ahead of time, I probably would have been proactive years ago to test this stuff,
I definitely will say, like, we've had people explicitly tell us it's the gamble of if it comes back non-detect, we're going to have to pay for it. That is the reason that we haven't done this.
Yep, understood.
This is a great discussion and really helpful. Thank you all.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Sorry for taking up so much time,
Oh.
and I felt like it was important to mention.
But how much time are we saving, if we get this across,
Right.
how much time are we saving all the other farmers and all the other producers? Like half an hour here is really saving.
Next time we can
weeks.
discuss liability with regards to information about rented land that belongs to someone else and not you. So that'll be fun. I'm kidding, it won't be fun.
So, Nancy, I guess the question for, just in terms of, I'm still thinking about the costs. How the department starts to think about it. and how open the program were to become, it would potentially become something that maybe we're gonna need to think about how to fund and whether we fund it out of the impacted PFAS, this space, or whether we ask for it in the budget allocation somewhere separately.
Exactly.
Be the numbers.
Right now, we absorb all of the testing that we can, and we're paying for it through the allocated budget that we have through the department. And just working with, the farms that we have, we're, $250,000 to $350,000 every 4 to 6 months. That's just with the farms we're dealing with. So yeah, I gotta crunch some numbers.
Yeah.
That's why the DEP isn't paying for some of this? It was their licensing that got us.
Well, they are, but they're really slow.
Right. Why the checks don't flow quicker. Or as Casella.
Right.
They pile it up every day. You know.
Right, I mean, we've got the funds that we've got for a really specific purpose. That's, and we are trying to start with what we think is the worst first, working off the information that we've got. So, off license spreading, if nobody ever told us that the stuff was put there, we don't know to go there to test it either. But, we've been finding that out anecdotally out in the field. So as we find those sort of things out, we add those fields to the list. So we went from, 700 sites, now we're well over 1,000 that we've identified because the list has been building. So we're trying to get to the places that we know of and deal with those.
And we've stopped spreading it, right? So we won't have.
Yeah, right.
So for the pile in Unity Plantation.
And a few
Grow and
others.
leave, and grow and leave.
Yeah, people call us, hey, did you know? No, we didn't. Thanks for telling us. Great. Yes, we'll try to figure out what to do about that as well.
Shut down the plantation. That's all I have to say. Shut down the plantation. Sorry.
Adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Fruitful conversation as always.
You are.